بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is a very important subject, talking about the role of Sharia in a democratic society. It brings up a lot of things that Muslims find themselves discussing often, and things that are discussed about Islam often by non-Muslims. We've all heard, conspiracy theories about the Islamization of America and how Sharia is taking over America. How that would actually happen is beyond me. I'm not really sure how people get these theories, but anyway. Okay, so the first question to ask when discussing the Sharia and its role for Muslims in a pluralistic democratic society is, what is the nature of the land we live in? And although this is not mentioned in the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet, a division that's developed by Muslim scholars within the first about 100 years of Islam is the notion of Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Islam, or the abode of war and the abode of Islam, or the abode of peace. And the abode of Islam is defined by almost all scholars as the place where the Sharia rules. Even if Muslims are a minority, it's the place where the Sharia rules. One famous scholar, Imam Nawawi, died 1277, a famous Shafi scholar, he added another clause to that definition where he said that even if you're a Muslim minority living in a non-Muslim state, but you're allowed to practice your religion freely and you're allowed to rule yourself according to the Sharia, then that can also be considered Dar al-Islam. Now, another important division that's added into that in the same period, the early Islamic period, is the notion of Dar al-Ahd or Dar al-Mu'ahada or Dar al-Sulh, which is the abode of treaty or the abode of agreement. Now, these are places that they're not Muslim states, they're not ruled by the Sharia, but they exist in peaceful treaties with the Muslim state. So Muslims can go and travel there and live there and do so with security. Some modern scholars like Tariq Ramadan have discussed the notion of Dar al-Dawah, that there's another concept of land today, which is the lands where Muslims can go and teach other people about Islam, Dar al-Dawah. Now, the general position of Muslim scholars throughout history has been that Muslims are allowed to live in non-Muslim lands. They're allowed to live outside the abode of Islam, provided they're able to practice their religion freely. And some more skeptical scholars have said, no, you have to have a reason for being there. You can't just be there for no reason. You have to be there on commerce or as a diplomatic mission or to do dawah, or something that's called maslaha Shariah, or something that has legitimate benefit, legitimate good. But when you think about the role of Muslims in the West today, I mean, our very existence is sort of dawah. So, I mean, I think that's been, that's a legitimizing feature of life for Muslims in the West or non-Muslim societies, is that they're basically constantly existing opportunities to teach people about Islam, and they in fact are the only representation, maybe the only positive representation of Islam in those societies. And it's very interesting that Imam Nawawi, I mentioned him earlier, in his discussion of whether Muslims should or should not live under non-Muslim rule, he said, if they're allowed to practice their religion freely, Muslims should live under non-Muslim rule. If they should stay there and remain there, because it gives them a chance to do dawah, it gives them a chance to teach people about Islam. And that is a very strong, legitimate good in Islam, in the eyes of Islam. One of the terms that often comes up when people are discussing Sharia in non-Muslim context is fiqh al-aqalliyat, which is often translated as the jurisprudence of minorities, or fiqh of minorities. I'm not sure who the first person to coin this term is. I think it might have been the late Sheikh Taha Jabir al-Alwani, rahimahullah. I think he might have been the first person to coin this term. But it's become a very commonly discussed issue amongst scholars, especially in the West. Also, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi has a book on it, and it's kind of the main theme of things like the European Council for Fatwa and Research and other fatwa bodies in the West. They see themselves developing this fiqh of minorities. One of the things that is probably the main feature of this fiqh of minorities is that it's very flexible. It sees itself as being very flexible because it sees itself as meeting unusual needs. The unusual needs of a community that's living, first of all, in a non-Muslim state, and second of all, in societies where there's often a good deal of hostility towards Muslims, either latent or explicit hostility. But the question, it's also a very controversial issue, a very controversial concept, this jurisprudence of minorities, because it comes with a danger. To what extent, when Muslims start taking advantage of the flexibility of their legal tradition, when they take advantage of, let's say, picking different rulings from different schools of law, or cobbling together rulings, or taking rukhsas or licenses here and there, you start risking indulging human desires. And even more than that, you start in the name of responding to to needs and pressures and necessities and dangers, you run the risk of reducing Muslims' capacity to really stand up strongly for their religion and the capacity of actually building a religious identity in those communities. And I'll get more into that, inshallah. So there's certainly a need for jurisprudence of minorities, but there's also a cost to it. And there's always a constant attempt to balance between meeting the legitimate needs of the Muslim community and also not paying too heavy a cost in doing so. When we talk about any issue of Islamic law, we always have to keep in mind the difference between thawabit wal mutaghayyirat. Thawabit and mutaghayyirat. Thawabit are those rulings that don't change, that are never going to change in any circumstances. For example, alcohol is always haram. Unless you're dying of thirst, it's haram. So it doesn't matter if you're in a place where no one drinks alcohol or in a place where everybody drinks alcohol, it's still going to be haram for a Muslim to drink alcohol. It's always going to be haram for a Muslim to eat pork unless they're dying of starvation. It doesn't matter whether you're in a society where that's common or not. Mutaghayyirat, on the other hand, are these laws that actually change based on place, time, circumstance. And the vast majority of the actual details of the Sharia are mutaghayyirat, in that they change based on time and place. It's important, there's an important legal maxim of Muslim scholars that rulings change according to time, place, person, and system. Again, this is talking about the rulings that actually do change, not all rulings, but the rulings that do change will change based on context. And I like to think about these as the contact surfaces of the law. These are the places where the law actually meets society, the contact surfaces between the law and society. So, for example, if you talk about things like mahar, how much mahar does a husband pay? The mahar is fixed. Husbands always have to pay a mahar. But how much that mahar is, this is totally based on time and place. What are the expectations of a spouse towards each other? What is the husband's job in the house? What is the wife's job in the house? These are also changed based on time and place. Things like a good example of thawabit versus mutaghayyirat, the awra of a man is always his navel to his knees. The awra of a woman is always the awra of a woman. But that's, in theory, I could come and give this lecture wearing, a towel wrapped around my waist going down to my knees, which would be really weird, yeah? I mean, that my awra would be covered, but it would be totally inappropriate. Because there's another level of dress beyond the awra, which is your notion of appropriate dress. And that notion of appropriate dress, although it will change based on time and place. So a lot of times Muslims get so caught up in the awra, they forget it's not just your awra that determines how you dress. There's also notions of appropriate dress, which differ in time and place. When you look at descriptions of Muslims in what's now Malaysia, Indonesia, in the 1500s, when European travelers would go there, the men would wear a sarong, so they would have their navel to their knee with a wrap, and then they just have maybe like a piece of cloth around their neck or something, but they were topless, basically. That's how the men dressed. And that was totally normal in their society. If we walked around like that, that would be extremely unusual. But in both are Islamic, and in both cases, our auras are covered. But that's not the only the only rulings of Islamic law. So for example, if I walked around with just a towel on all the time, I might have my aura covered, but I would not be considered adil. I wouldn't be able to give witness in court. I wouldn't be a respected person. I wouldn't be able to hold a lot of public positions of public office in a Muslim society because I'm not actually a person who is upstanding character. Okay. Now, another issue that comes up in this context is the notion of talfiq or takhayyur. This is kind of mixing and matching between different schools of law. This is something that Muslims debate a lot of the time. Now, the main theme in fiqh al-aqalliyat, or minority jurisprudence, is that all schools of law, and this is true, agree that you can pick and choose from different schools of law, or let's say this, you can take something outside your school of law if there is necessity or need present. If need and necessity is present. And sometimes a systematic need can take the place of necessity. So if you have a systematic need, this can become like necessity. So a good example of this in let's say the United States is Jumma Timings. So now, if you know most mosques in the U.S., you'll have 2 or 3 Jumma prayers on a Friday. And this is actually pretty controversial. Or let's take a step back. In the Hanbali school of law, you can have Jummah anytime from the morning onward. Doesn't have to be during the Dhuhr time. So if you want to have Jummah earlier than, you want to expand the time when you can have Jummah prayer, you can take the Hanbali ruling and then have it earlier than you normally would, earlier than the Dhuhr prayer. But actually, it was not, Muslims didn't have this multiple Jummahs until relatively recently. This is very much a feature of life of Muslims in the West because people have, there's relatively little mosque space, there's limited parking, people have their different lunch hours. And so this license was taken because of a systematic need in the society. By the way, in case you're thinking that, American Muslims or Western Muslims came up with this totally unprecedented practice, originally, going back into the 700s and 800s of the Common Era, there was only one Jummah prayer period in a city. Let's say Kufa or Basra or Baghdad. There was one Jummah Masjid Jami', one Jummah mosque, one congregational mosque, and there was one Jummah prayer for everybody in the whole city. And what happened is, as cities like Baghdad started getting too big for that in the late 700s, the early 800s, the caliphs actually had to go and talk to the ulama and get fatwas to build more than one congregational mosque. And then that became the norm. But actually, even if you read the histories of medieval Islamic civilization, even as late as the 1000s, caliphs in Baghdad were still getting fatwas to build new congregational mosques because it was still kind of an unprecedented thing to do to have Muslims pray in different places at the same time. So now not only do we pray in different places at the same time, we pray in different places at multiple times on a Friday. This is because of a systematic need. And just another example of this is a lot of times these rulings are not core rulings of the Shariah, things that everybody agree. Alcohol is prohibited, pork is prohibited, riba is prohibited. These are things like, for example, in the Shafi school, men are not supposed to look in the face of women they're not related to. But there's a dispensation or an exception made for a teacher who's teaching someone the Quran or some Islamic science if they're the opposite sex. In that case, you can look at the student, they can look at you, because that's a systematic need that you're not going to be able to avoid in order to pursue this good. Now, what about, as I mentioned before, the problem with this is that if you are always thinking, well, I have this need, I have this necessity, in America, it's really hard to pray. You leave the house, you go downtown to go shopping, you're out, then you have to go, do this other errand, you're still out of your house, and you're going to miss Dhuhr, so you're going to combine Dhuhr and Asr prayer. Now, yes, there is, a position in the Maliki school of law which says that you can combine your Dhuhr and Asr prayer even if there's no danger or if you're not traveling, provided it doesn't become a habit. But think about this. What are you not doing? You're not just praying in public. You could pray anywhere. You could pray on the side of the road. You could pray in, a section of the department store. And you can pray in the airport, right? We all know the answer to this is, I don't want to do that because I don't want people to look at me, maybe I'm afraid. But when you take advantage of this license not to do that, what are you doing? You're not establishing your identity. You're not actually affirming your practice as a Muslim. You're not affirming the presence of the Muslim community in this country. And that's a cost. There's a real cost there. And if you think about this as an example, this is a generalization, I think it's an accurate generalization, which is that Muslims, especially from the Arab world, tend not to be super strict about halal meat. Muslims from South Asia tend to be super strict about halal meat. Now, if all Muslims in this country had been really strict about halal meat and had refused to eat anything that's not halal meat, we would have made sure that we owned lots of butcher shops. We would have made sure that lots of restaurants carried this. And in some Muslim countries, or in some countries where they have Muslim minorities, let's say like in New Zealand and other places like that, almost all the meat that's produced is halal, because Muslims were so insistent on this issue, and it became economically beneficial for the meat industry in that country to take Muslims' needs into consideration. If you don't insist on it, if you don't push on it, you end up eating a lot of vegetarian food and a lot of fish for a while, but sooner or later, your need will end up changing the society. If you don't insist on that, you won't actually affect that positive change. And just another good example of that in the US, the Somali Muslim community tends to be very strict on issue of riba. They don't want to take any riba. Other Muslims are not so strict on that, or they engage in Islamic finance through organizations that, and then you get into the whole Islamic finance debate, whether or not it's really different from conventional finance or not. I'm not interested in talking about that. My point is, Somali community in general, in places like Seattle, Minneapolis, Columbus, Ohio, they don't see any of this Islamic finance or American finance as legitimate. So I remember when I used to live in Seattle, you'd see a lot of criticism of the Somali community. They're not owning homes, they're not gaining equity, they're remaining as poor community because they're refusing to engage in interest. And this was a criticism, but then they actually developed on their own all sorts of community mechanisms for finance. One of them is called the Hagbad. This is a Tuya or the Hagbad. This is actually like a collaborative within, let's say, a group of Somali families. They will put money into a co-op, a collaborative, and then people can draw out of that collaborative to when they have something that they want to buy or that require more money than they normally have. So actually, because they're in a position of need, instead of taking advantage of, let's say, the Hanafi ruling that says that if you're in the abode of outside of the Muslim world, you can engage in impermissible transactions. So you can engage in riba transactions. That's what lots of Muslims do. They engage in riba transactions because they think of themselves outside of the abode of Islam, and they're allowed to do this as the opinion of the Hanafi school of law. So if you take that ruling, your life is easier. You can buy a car, you can buy a house with no problem, but you won't be forced to come up with solutions that are actually Islamically legitimate and which will create growth and strengthen the Muslim community's identity. So the Somali community actually has their own mechanisms. And by the way, in cities like Seattle and Minneapolis, now the local governments, the city governments, actually offer interest-free Islamic loans to people in the Somali community. because the Somali community pushed this and didn't compromise on it, that even the government, the non-Muslim government, ended up providing this for them. Okay. So, I mean, I think it's tough to know when, let's say, when is my need strong enough that I can excuse taking this rukhsa or this license, taking a ruling from another school of law which will allow me to get a loan, which will allow me to shake hands with someone of the opposite sex. When is your need strong enough to legitimate that versus when are you kind of, let's just say, indulging yourself a little bit and potentially also sacrificing a chance for your community to build itself, to build its religious infrastructure. My own sense is, it's tough, it's obviously going to be a subjective call, but what I would say is, I would ask myself this question, is it realistic for me to live in this society without doing X or without doing Y? Something, let's say, like shaking hands. This is just my opinion, right? I think it's unrealistic for Muslims to live in the United States and not shake hands with people of the opposite sex. It will be, this will be too common, it will be too disruptive, and it's too hard to explain to people why you don't do this. And this causes real issues of offense. I think it's unrealistic in the United States to wear like a full niqab with your entire face covered. I think that's unrealistic. People see face-to-face communication as too important. You have issues of ID, you have issues of security. But other things like interest, saying we don't want to take to engage in interest, things like not hugging, things like hijab, things like, I can't think of the other example I had. But I mean, these things, it's actually very realistic that we can come up with Muslim alternatives to the kind of conventional behavior in American society, and there's no need for us to take advantage of licenses on those issues. Okay. Finally, I just wanted to, when you talk about Sharia in a democratic society, especially a non-Muslim democratic society, you have to think about what are all the different areas of the Sharia. The Sharia is the Sharia is the idea of God's law. It's the idea of God's law. It covers every area of human interaction for Muslims. Now, so when we think about the Sharia in a country like America, we have to think about where does the Sharia and, let's say, issues of law in this country actually overlap. And I've kind of come up with a list, and I'll go from the areas in which the Sharia has the least overlap with American law to where it has the most overlap. So the first is acts of worship or ibadah, prayer, fasting, things like that. Here, alhamdulillah, we have constitutional guarantee for freedom of exercise, free exercise of religion. So we have the right to pray, we have the right to fast. Our employers and our governments have to indulge our desires to practice our religion as long as it's not excessively obstructive. So here we have almost total freedom, and there's very little overlap with American law. Then you have things like ethics, adab, manners, akhlaq, adab. Here the Sharia, of course, preaches honesty, charity, respect for others, respect for family, respect for elders. And again, these are not legal issues in the United States. If you go around and you're honest and you're kind to people, no one's going to say, "Are you following the Sharia?" Because I don't like the Sharia. No one's going to even notice this. So this is not a big deal. Another area where we have tremendous freedom is in inheritance. So this is interestingly, I found out recently where this came from. This is from Roman law. This idea that you can just make up a will and say, I want to give all my money to my cat, or I want to give all my money to, the NRA or whatever. This is the idea that you can do whatever you want with your wealth. This is a Roman law notion, but then it was adopted into British common law, and then of course we got it in the United States. So this is because you can give your will to your estate to whoever you want. You can actually just say, I want my inherit my estate distributed according to, let's say, the Hanbali school of law or the Shafi'i school of law. Now, there is, of course, a threat here, which is these bills that have 23 different state houses have proposed bills like this. And I think last time I counted, either 7 or 11 states in this country had passed anti-Sharia legislation. The initial one was in Oklahoma. That was then overturned by the federal district court there because it was obviously discriminatory against a religious group. So then after that, they started rephrasing these bills as just anti-foreign law bills, not allowing foreign law. Now the problem is that in theory, and I haven't actually seen any other cases, federal cases, or in any of the federal district court or circuit court, or certainly not Supreme Court. I haven't seen any cases where this has been overturned yet. Maybe I just don't know that, but I haven't come across it. I think it will get overturned because it's ridiculous. First of all, if I have a deal with a Japanese company and the contract says that it's going to get adjudicated according to Japanese law, and now an American court can't apply that because it's foreign law, well, if I'm a businessman, I'm going to be furious. So it's no foreign law things, utter horseradish. But it's intended to target Muslims. Now the worry here is that if like for example, my will says I want my estate distributed according to the Hanbali school of law. So now the worry is that if that's taken to a probate court in the United States, that if you're in a state where Sharia law is technically illegal, they could say, oh, this will is inadmissible. This will is inadmissible. And in fact, about 2 years ago, the British Bar Association was distributing, guidelines for lawyers to help Muslims make wills according to Islamic law. There's nothing wrong with this. But then they got in serious PR trouble for promoting kind of Sharia discrimination against women in inheritance. In fact, these lawyers were just, you have customers who come and says, I want to give all my money to my cat. I want to give all my money to my one kid because I hate my other kids. This is all totally legal. But somehow when Muslims say, I want to give, let's say, 2 times the amount of money to my son and one unit of money to my daughter, suddenly this becomes discrimination. So this is where you see Islamophobia really creeping into the way people think about the law. So inshallah, these anti-Sharia bills won't interfere with this. Then the next thing is mu'amalat. Mu'amalat are people's interactions with each other, especially commercial interactions. So in one area of this would be things like contracts and sales. Now, there's not a lot of contradiction here between the Sharia and, let's say, American law, because even in the Sharia, the majority of rules regarding contracts and sales are based on urf, or based on local custom. So, you think about this. You go into a restaurant, you order a hamburger, and they bring the check to you, and it says, that's $1 million. You say, what are you talking about? No, that was the million. You should look at the menu. This is the $1 million hamburger. It's made of pure unicorn meat, right? You can say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to pay that. It's like, well, but think about it. This is very interesting. When you go into a restaurant and you order, you're actually making an implicit contract that you're going to pay for the food you get. But there's actually also the implicit understanding that there's a sort of understood range of how much food costs in restaurants. So we're actually constantly engaging in contracts we don't even know about because they're so embedded in the urf and the custom of our society, we don't even think about the fact that we're engaging in contracts. So the Sharia seeds the details of what contracts can consist of, when is a contract valid, or when is it agreed upon. A lot of this is based on urf. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Of course, there's some red lines, no riba, no gharar, which is excessive risk. But then again, also, there's all sorts of exemptions in the sunnah of the Prophet. The Prophet ﷺ himself gives exemptions to some of these rules. So for example, if you're very poor, you can sell the fruits of your tree. It's called bay' al-araya. You can sell the fruits of your tree before they're even ripe to get money to feed your family. Now, in general, you couldn't do that because that's a gharar, because you're selling something that doesn't exist yet. Maybe the fruits won't become ripe in the end. Maybe the tree will get knocked down by a storm or something. But in this case, because it's necessity, you can do so. Other thing where we see this in our society is what's called istisna. It's a classical Islamic idea, but we see it very much in our society, which is buying things on order. So let's say, I ordered my shirt to get made, and the company runs my credit card on the website. I've paid for it, or my debit card. I've paid for it in that moment. The shirt doesn't exist yet. But in our society, it's so well established that I know what the shirt is going to be. If I don't like it, I can send it back. There's no actual excessive risk. These are all exceptions that we have from the Sunnah of the Prophet himself. Other types of mu'amalat are personal interactions. And here, again, we get to the issue of handshakes. Now, this is just, it's not only my opinion. The European Council of Fatwa and Research has also given the fatwa that men and women can shake hands if it's needed in Western societies. Why do I think this is, as I said, why do I think this is a legitimate license to take? Because it's simply it's really unrealistic to walk around in a business environment, in a social environment, and not shake hands with people. The amount of time it takes to explain to someone why you're not shaking their hand, you don't even have enough time to discuss this with all the people you're going to be shaking hands with if you walk into a room. If someone, for example, let's say, I wear let's say I'm decided, I think Muslim men should do this. They should have to wear something that marks them as Muslim men, because we get away really free ride and women have to do all the work. But let's say I wear a Pakistani outfit. If someone says, hey, why are you wearing that outfit? And I say, well, this is actually a Pakistani outfit, and I'm wearing it because, I'm Muslim, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But to be able to have that conversation every time you're asked to shake someone's hands, almost impossible. And it really does cause a lot of resentment. And by the way, it's very interesting when you go back and you look at classical books of fiqh, the idea that people don't, men and women who aren't related don't ever touch hands with each other, this is actually a very class-based ruling. So if you look at, let's say, books of Hanbali law, yes, elite men and women, especially elite women, would never go and touch a man's hand. They wouldn't even be seen by a man. That's because they're elite. They don't even have to leave the house. They have other people to do that for them. But if you're, let's say, like a working class man or woman, and you're in the street selling, apricots or whatever, or nuts on the street, you're going to be constantly interacting with people of the opposite sex, and you're going to be touching them. You're going to be physically touching them, to hand things to them, to make deals. So a lot of these laws, when we talk about kind of absolutely no physical contact in hands, these are actually for elites. And they, in a way, in America, we're all working class Muslims in that sense. We're all constantly interacting with people of the opposite sex. Finally, getting toward the area where there's a lot more overlap with American law is the notion of marriage, divorce, child custody. Now, this is very interesting. Of course, this is a lot of times when people talk about Sharia, this is what they get upset about. I remember I just had my class read Glenn Beck's book, It Is About Islam. That's a really stupid book, by the way. It costs 99 cents if you want to get it used. I'm just telling you, that's how stupid it is. It only costs 99 cents. But one of the things he talks about, he gets very angry that American courts are applying Sharia law in marriage, which is funny because that's actually what? That's American courts who are taking the marriage contract of Muslims and considering it as a legitimate prenuptial agreement. And if you look at, so some American states, New York, Florida, there's been cases where they have taken prenuptial agreement, or the contract that Muslims have when they get married, and said, no, this is actually like a prenup. And so if the couple gets divorced, we force the man to pay the back-end mahr he owes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, other states like California and Maryland have not honored these, have not seen them as contracts. They said, either this is a religious thing, it's not really a contract. And you can imagine if someone just goes to the mosque and they fill out the standard little marriage contract which says, we get married according to the values of the Sharia and stuff like that. This is more like a religious document. It doesn't look like a legal contract. But one case in Maryland, actually Montgomery County where I used to live, was a Pakistani couple. They got married in Pakistan, and they lived in the United States for many, many years. They became citizens, And when the husband divorced the wife, the husband said, I only owe my wife what my original dowry was, mahar was to her in Pakistan, 30 years ago. And the court in Maryland actually said, no, we refuse to honor, in this case, a foreign marriage, which they would normally honor, because they said this goes against our public policy. This woman's now a citizen of the United States, a resident of the state of Maryland, and she has to get more of your assets than, she sat at home and cooked for 30 years for you. You're not going to get away with just paying the mahar you promised her 30 years ago. But actually, so in the United States, I think we've seen already numerous instances where Muslims have their marriage contracts are honored as valid contracts by family courts in the United States. Now, when would this not be the case is like this case in Maryland, when the family court sees it as against public policy or what's called unconscionability. So for any prenuptial agreement, it's not accepted if it's unconscionable. What does that mean? It's just something totally outrageous, something that's just, we get married on condition that if I divorce you, or if you want to divorce me, you have to chop off your own ears or something like that. Just something totally ridiculous. Also things that are based on changes in people's lives, like they make the agreement when they don't have kids and later on they have kids. It's a big change in their life. Now, some people would say, well, a lot of Islamic law is really nasty and unconscionable to American values. That's kind of like what this court in Maryland was saying. But I actually don't think that this is, again, an example of Islamophobia really creeping in and kind of bias really creeping into the way people think about this issue. Because let's say I'm, super duper rich movie star or Silicon Valley entrepreneur, and I want to marry somebody, and I say, okay, I'll marry you, but if we get divorced, you're not going to get a single penny, and if you gain X amount of weight, you're going to be automatically divorced from me, and I could have all sorts of horrible things in my marriage contract. Now, people do this in the United States. This is actually accepted. These are not unconscionable. But somehow when a Muslim does something, then it becomes unconscionable. So I think this is something, again, Muslims are going to have to fight, which is say, look, why is it that this guy wants to give all his money to one of his kids, and that's fine. I want to give money to my kids based on Sharia, and because one of them gets more money than the other, that's unconscionable? Same thing for a marriage contract. Okay. Finally, the last thing is criminal law. And of course, when people talk about Sharia, if you watch Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, or pretty much any movie I can think of that mentions Muslims, obviously someone's going to have to get their hand cut off. Someone's going to get stoned. This is almost the only thing people even know about the Sharia when you ask normal Americans about the Sharia. This is completely not applicable. It's completely not applicable for Muslims living in the West or a non-Muslim society, because the criminal law is always the responsibility of the sultan. The sultan meaning the authority or the government, or what's sometimes called the wali al-amr, or the government, the person in charge of these things, whether it's the judge or the ruler. They always have to supervise and permit any criminal law punishments. And if any of you are interested in this, I wrote an article about this, I think after the Pulse nightclub shooting, about the unanimous agreement amongst Muslim scholars that even things like you read about like qisas in the Quran, where an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, this doesn't mean you can literally go up, if someone poked my eye out, I don't go up and poke their eye out. That means I go and say to the judge and say, so-and-so poked my eye out. I would like to be compensated for this, or I would like their eye poked out. In reality, people just get compensated for it. I've never actually come across a case where someone gets their eye poked out for having poked out someone else's eye. People take compensation money for it. So any of these things, even though when you read about them in the Quran, it seems to be this very private wrong that's done, and then there's some kind of retribution privately done. This is actually all supervised and required to be supervised by the state authority, the government authority. So in the case of criminal law, this is just not applicable in the United States, because if we were in a Muslim country, this is also be done by the government, not by private individuals. So, a final maybe lesson to think about or point to think about is that idea that I stressed several times, which is Muslims who are living in the West are living in a society that is in which Islam is unfamiliar, in which Muslims are unfamiliar, in which we have a lot of pressures on us, in which we sometimes have legitimate fear for our safety. And it's tempting to constantly indulge in various licenses in our law, various rukhsas in our legal tradition, in order to avoid ever coming into contact with any of these uncomfortable elements, or even elements that are just inconvenient. But the more we indulge, the less we assert ourselves, and the less of a religious infrastructure we build for our community in this country. So it's very important that we shouldn't always see things as needs. Sometimes they're challenges, and challenges need to be overcome. Jazakumullah khair.